In December of 1989, Romania was on the verge of collapse. Hunger, repression, and constant surveillance had brought the country to a breaking point. The population took to the streets, and the fear that had lasted for decades began to fracture. The absolute power of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu was faltering. For years, they had controlled every aspect of national life, from the factories and the universities to the courts and the secret police. No one was out of their reach. No one could disobey without paying a price. Now the uprising was advancing without restraint, and the regime was collapsing. The figure of Elena, presented as mother of the nation and exemplary scientist, became the target of open hatred. Who decided her fate when the country rose up? Why did even her closest allies turn their backs on her? How did the most feared woman end up facing the most brutal end? The dangerous ambition, a peasant woman against her fate. On the 7th of January 1916, Elena Petrescu was born in the village of Petresti in Dâmbovița County. Her family was part of the poor peasantry of southern Romania, an environment where subsistence farming and animal husbandry set the pace of daily life. She was the third of 6 children in a household where physical effort and farm work absorbed all available energy. Her childhood was spent in an environment where education was not a priority, especially for girls in rural areas. Elena grew up without literacy, a common condition in her community, though in her case it extended into adolescence and left marks that she would later try to hide through the manipulation of her official biography. In contrast with her sisters, who unquestioningly accepted domestic and agricultural tasks, Elena showed a different attitude from a young age. She rejected traditional expectations that linked women to obedience, early marriage, and motherhood as their sole destiny. Those who remembered her in the village noted that she conveyed a desire to differentiate herself, to aspire to a place that did not correspond with her peasant origins. That inclination explains that upon reaching youth, she sought to leave the rural environment and head to Bucharest. The capital offered possibilities that the countryside could not provide: factories, unions, and the political hotbed of a society in crisis. During the 1930s, Bucharest was a scene of social unrest. The monarchy faced increasing pressures while far-right movements like the Iron Guard contested the street with communist groups, which had been banned since the previous decade. Police repression did not prevent small clandestine cells from operating in factories and working-class neighborhoods. It was in this environment that Elena found employment as a textile worker. The industry absorbed abundant female labor under harsh conditions and minimal wages. For her, entering the factory also meant the first direct contact with spaces where political ideas different from those known in her village circulated. The communist networks used those workshops as recruitment places. Secret meetings were organized, illegal pamphlets were distributed, and the feeling of being part of a struggle with greater horizons was conveyed. Elena approached these circles despite her limited education. In that environment, the lack of studies was not an impediment. What was valued was discipline, loyalty, and the willingness to take risks against the police. For a young woman seeking to escape the limitations of her origin, that environment represented not only a space of belonging, but also a path to social advancement in a society where few opportunities existed for women without resources. In 1939, she met Nicolae Ceaușescu, a young communist militant several years younger than she. Despite his young age, he had already faced arrests and gained a reputation as a determined activist. The meeting between the two was not limited to a personal level. For Elena, the relationship with Nicolae offered a stronger access channel to the clandestine party structures. For him, she provided emotional support and a figure of reference in the midst of a persecutory environment. The union was consolidated in the following years when the repression against the communists intensified. Nicolae was arrested on multiple occasions during the 1940s, reinforcing his internal prestige. Elena, although not standing out as a theorist or leader, remained close, consolidating a role defined by the ability to establish personal connections and take advantage of situations. The outbreak of the Second World War changed the Romanian political framework. In 1940, the country lost territories to the Soviet Union, Hungary, and Bulgaria, weakening the legitimacy of the monarchy. The following year, under the leadership of Marshal Ion Antonescu, Romania joined as an ally of Nazi Germany. The Communist Party remained banned, but the link with Moscow kept it as an option that could gain relevance if the war took a different turn. Elena and Nikolai remained in hiding, becoming accustomed to living under surveillance, with discreet meetings and a constant need to change refuge. In August of 1944, with the entry of the Red Army into Bucharest and the ousting of Antonescu, the situation took a decisive turn. The Communist Party, until then marginalized, emerged as a force backed by the occupying power. Overnight, persecuted militants came to occupy spaces in the new political order. Nikolai began to rise in the hierarchy, taking advantage of his experience and Soviet support. Elena accompanied him on that path, consolidating her presence in party events and reinforcing her image as a figure associated with a rising cadre. The transformation of the political system culminated in December of 1947 when the monarchy was abolished and the People's Republic of Romania was proclaimed. That same year, Elena and Nikolai were married. The temporal coincidence between their personal union and the birth of the new regime reflected the way they both envisioned themselves within the system that was beginning to consolidate. Although they were not yet part of the ruling elite, their position was solid to advance in the process of purging and reorganization that characterized the communist parties of the Eastern Bloc in the post-war period. Discipline, loyalty to Moscow, and the ability to maneuver in a changing environment assured them an increasingly visible place in the state structure. Elena thus completed a first metamorphosis, from an illiterate peasant to a militant installed in the emerging power spaces in Bucharest, accompanied by a partner who was steadily advancing in the party hierarchy. The invented myth, the wife-turned-scientist. After the establishment of the People's Republic of Romania in December of 1947, the Communist Party consolidated itself as the backbone of the new state power under the direct tutelage of Moscow. Thus began a systematic process of eliminating political rivals, nationalizing institutions, and restructuring society. The former parties were dissolved, the monarchy was abolished, and opponents were marginalized or imprisoned. The Soviet military victory had paved the way for a model of control in which the Romanian Communist Party, until recently a marginal and clandestine organization, became a hegemonic instrument. In this context, Elena Ceaușescu, newly married to Nikolai, found a fertile environment to advance. Her name was not among the top personalities of the party, but her proximity to the new rising figure allowed her to place herself within networks that, over time, would prove crucial. While Nikolai began his upward career under the protection of the leader Gheorghe Dej, she moved in a discreet background, cultivating ties and observing the mechanisms of power. Gheorghe Dej, at the head of the party since the late 1940s, imposed a strict regime subordinated to the Soviet Union. He was responsible for internal purges that ensured his absolute control. Nikolai, considerably younger, became one of his protégés. He held positions in the Union of Communist Youth, later in the Ministry of Armed Forces, and gradually rose to become an influential figure within the apparatus. His discipline, organizational capacity, and willingness to follow the dictated line positioned him as a natural candidate for succession. Meanwhile, Elena was consolidating a less visible role, but one of growing influence. She lacked prominence in the leadership bodies, although in private conversations she gained weight. She was not attributed with strategic acumen, but she did have the ability to ensure her own benefits and for her closest circle. Her loyalty to Nikolai and her constant presence in meetings and events reinforced the idea of an inseparable companion. The decisive change in her trajectory came accompanied by a carefully elaborated project, the construction of an academic identity. Elena had arrived in Bucharest without training and with just basic notions of reading and writing. These deficiencies were recorded in the party's internal records. The new communist elite, however, required symbols that represented the triumph of the working class and the possibility of ascent thanks to socialism. In that framework, her transformation was designed. She enrolled in evening courses and later in the Polytechnic University of Bucharest. Her performance was limited, but the intervention of the authorities ensured the passing of exams and academic progression. Teachers and classmates pointed out her low participation, but any objection was neutralized by political pressure. Thus, she obtained degrees in the field of chemistry and a position at the Institute of Chemical Research. Since then, She began to appear as the author of articles and patents prepared by teams of researchers who were forced to sign under her name by official decree. The state narrative presented that biography as proof of the social mobility that socialism made possible. Elena was no longer described as the wife of a leader, but became a scientist of international prestige. The propaganda portrayed her as a pioneering researcher in the field of polymers, recognized at foreign conferences and honored by institutions of the socialist bloc. Honorary distinctions from universities and academies reinforced the image. The fiction was maintained through a bureaucratic apparatus that guaranteed her inclusion in studies and projects without effective participation. The parallel rise of Nicolae helped to strengthen that representation. In the 1960s, already a central figure of the party, he accumulated positions of increasing relevance. The death of Gheorghiu Dej in 1965 placed him in a leadership position, and with his appointment as General Secretary, the propaganda machinery was intensified. The official discourse exalted the couple as an exemplary model of Romanian socialism. He as a wise leader and conductor of the country, she as an intellectual and mother of the nation. The cult of personality was reflected in portraits located in schools, factories, and public offices. School textbooks presented their biographies as examples to follow. The press published laudatory articles describing Elena as a brilliant researcher. In ceremonies and congresses, her name was repeated in songs, poems, and speeches. The exaltation included elements of gender. She was presented as the embodiment of the working woman who, thanks to the party, achieved the highest scientific achievements. In 1967, Elena was appointed director of the Institute of Chemical Research in Bucharest. Under her management, research teams were forced to include her as a co-author in publications and to assign her credit in patents. Her name appeared in dozens of works, even though she did not participate in their drafting. State propaganda promoted these works as personal contributions, consolidating the gap between the reality of her training and the public image that was being imposed. In the academic system, the contradiction was evident, but the fear of reprisals prevented questioning. Any criticism could mean the loss of the position, professional exclusion, or even criminal consequences. In this way, the fiction remained intact. The trips abroad further reinforced the myth. Each official visit was accompanied by tributes and honorary titles awarded by institutions from allied countries. These recognitions were immediately reproduced in the Romanian media as proof of the international admiration for his scientific work. The 1970s marked the culmination of this construction. Nicolae, in full exercise of absolute power, sought to project Romania as an independent country within the socialist bloc. The image of Elena as a recognized scientist served that strategy, offering the idea of a state capable of producing intellectual figures admired abroad. The ceremonies in her honor, the medals received, and the publications bearing her signature were promoted as symbols of national prestige. By 1974, Elena had ceased being just the wife of the top leader to become an institutionalized myth. The gap between her actual ability and the figure presented to the people was immense, but censorship prevented any contradiction. In the records, her name appeared associated with scientific achievements of global reach, while in daily life the researchers continued working under pressure to maintain the fiction. Propaganda had managed to consolidate a second metamorphosis, from discreet militant to internationally recognized academic, supported by a system in which fiction was inseparable from politics. The hidden power Elena commands in the shadows. In March of 1974, Elena Ceaușescu took office as President of the Socialist Republic of Romania. With that appointment, a power that he already exercised absolutely in practice was formalized. The investiture also expanded the influence of Elena Ceaușescu, who ceased to be a companion to become an active part of the ruling core. From then on, her presence in decision-making bodies was more visible, and her ability to intervene in the state apparatus intensified. Elena's rise resulted in high-level formal positions. She was a member of the Central Committee of the Romanian Communist Party and held seats in the Great National Assembly, a legislative body controlled by the regime. Additionally, she served as Vice President of the National Council of Science and Technology, a key institution in the official narrative projecting Romania as a scientifically developing country under the principles of socialism. These positions gave her direct access to state resources, strategic information, and power networks, which she managed personally. In the academic field, her control reached unprecedented dimensions. She directed the Institute of Chemistry and accumulated distinctions in national and international academies, which reinforced the propaganda about her supposed status as a researcher. But beyond that image, she exercised direct influence in the appointment of academic positions and the distribution of funding. Professors, rectors, and research managers depended on her approval to maintain their positions. Personal loyalty to Elena became an indispensable requirement for surviving in the Romanian intellectual world. His influence expanded into the governmental field when he assumed the first vice presidency of the Council of Ministers at the end of the 1970s. That position granted him control over sensitive areas such as education, culture, and social affairs. No curriculum, school manual, or university program was implemented without going through his supervision. The official ideology was reinforced in each educational material, and on numerous occasions, references to his supposed scientific achievements were incorporated. This control over the education of the youth constituted one of the most effective instruments for consolidating his image. Beyond the formal structure, Elena developed an informal cabinet that functioned as a parallel power center. Ministers, ambassadors, and senior officials were summoned directly to her office, and their careers largely depended on those interviews. A simple sign of disapproval could determine the dismissal or marginalization of a political figure. In practice, this cabinet operated as a personal court, where favoritism and arbitrariness prevailed. The competition to show absolute obedience created an atmosphere of permanent fear. In the meetings of the Central Committee, Elena frequently intervened, interrupting speakers and correcting interventions even without sufficient technical training. High-ranking officials were reprimanded in public, which consolidated a climate of submission. Over time, her authority generated a fear even greater than that caused by Nicolae himself. Although he was the head of state and general secretary of the party, the widespread perception was that the most feared figure in the corridors of power was Elena. Her ability to decide appointments or dismissals positioned her as the real arbitrator in political and administrative matters. The couple appeared together at official events. Elena occupied prominent places in ceremonies, congresses, and travels, which reinforced the impression that she played a role equivalent to that of her husband. Official speeches and the media made constant references to her scientific wisdom and her role in the country's progress. Her portraits appeared alongside Nicolae's in public institutions and workplaces. The propaganda apparatus systematically fed the idea that she was not just the president's wife, but a leader fully exercising power. Surveillance and distrust became common mechanisms of control. Elena instigated discreet purges within the political elite, encouraged internal intrigues, and fostered rivalries among officials to maintain her unquestioned authority. Diplomats, academics, and party leaders were constantly evaluated. The suspicion of disloyalty, even without evidence, could mean the end of a career. Her presence generated a climate of paranoia in which obedience became the only means of survival for those who were part of the ruling elite. Between 1974 and 1980, the regime became progressively more rigid. Nicolae sought to project Romania as a state with certain independence from Moscow in the international sphere, but internally control was increasingly reinforced. Elena played a decisive role in this process, ensuring that every level of the apparatus responded to both the official structure and her personal authority. Her influence extended from school programs to ministerial appointments and from scientific projects to diplomatic decisions. The result was the consolidation of a dual power in which the boundaries between the figure of the head of state and that of his wife became blurred. Elena Ceaușescu was recognized and feared in all areas. In the corridors of institutions, the possibility of a gesture of disapproval was enough to seal the fate of officials of any rank. Her figure, omnipresent in the 1970s, had transformed into a symbol of a regime that combined propaganda, repression, and arbitrariness. The hungry country, misery for the people, luxuries for the court. At the beginning of the 1980s, Romania faced a critical economic situation. During the previous years, the regime had resorted to loans from Western banks to finance large industrial projects and partially modernize the infrastructure. The international oil crisis made credit more expensive and reduced the ability to pay, and Nicolae Ceaușescu adopted a radical policy: to liquidate the external debt in the shortest possible time, regardless of the internal consequences. The strategy was presented as an act of economic independence and defense of national sovereignty. In practice, it meant diverting a large part of agricultural, energy, and industrial production abroad. Export contracts were negotiated from the president's inner circle, and any needs of the population were subordinated to the priority of debt repayment. Ships loaded with grains, meat, and oil departed for foreign markets, while Romanian stores remained empty. The official media justified the measure as a necessary sacrifice for future generations, but in daily life, the scarcity was evident. In 1981, a rationing system for basic foods was established. Bread, meat, oil, and sugar were distributed with coupons, although the quantities were minimal and often not available in stores. Entire families spent hours in long queues to receive insufficient rations. The diet was reduced to subsistence levels, and malnutrition problems increased, especially among children. The official discourse claimed that the Romanians consumed excessively, and that it was necessary to correct eating habits, a justification that contrasted with the reality of the households. The restrictions were not limited to food. To save foreign currency, the regime drastically reduced domestic consumption of electricity and heating. In winter, the maximum allowed temperature in apartments was set at 14 degrees, although in many buildings the system barely worked. Electricity was cut off for several hours each day across the country, forcing millions of people to spend the nights in the dark. The use of electrical appliances was limited, and public lighting was reduced to a minimum. In the cities, the streets were deserted after sunset, in an atmosphere of hardship that became part of the routine. While the population faced hardships, the contrast with the life of the Ceaușescu family became increasingly stark. Elena and Nicolae lived in the Primăverii Palace in Bucharest, equipped with luxuries unimaginable to most. Trips abroad, private banquets, clothes from Western designers, and jewelry were part of their daily life. Elena amassed diamond necklaces, exclusive suits, and collections of shoes and fur coats. The family had additional residences in places like Snagov, all with access to amenities denied to the rest of the country. The accumulation of wealth included assets abroad and hidden accounts, managed through trusted intermediaries. Although these details remained out of the population's reach during the regime, rumors circulated about the family's luxury, fueled by accounts from employees and close officials. The contrasts were too visible. While the citizens endured scarce rations and power cuts, the Ceaușescu traveled in luxury cars, hosted lavish receptions, and appeared at official events dressed ostentatiously. The propaganda tried to hide those differences by presenting Elena as a hard-working and austere woman dedicated to science and the progress of the nation. However, images of the couple at international receptions, surrounded by abundance, circulated unofficially and reinforced the perception of an insurmountable gap between rulers and the ruled. In this context, Elena's figure acquired an especially unpopular character. Although Nicolae was the official face of the regime, she became a symbol of contempt towards the people. Her name appeared in portraits, school manuals, and scientific publications, but in daily life it was associated with arrogance and luxury amid scarcity. The obligatory title of Comrade Doctor and the insistence on recognizing her supposed academic achievements further highlighted the contrast with the reality of the population. For many Romanians, Elena did not represent the mother of the nation proclaimed in official speeches, but the embodiment of distant power that imposed sacrifices while enjoying privileges. The discontent manifested itself in discreet ways, always under the risk of surveillance and repression. In the lines to get bread or meat, low-voiced comments circulated about the luxuries of the presidential family. Citizens shared clandestine jokes that ridiculed their ignorance and ostentation. These expressions of popular criticism, transmitted informally, reinforced a collective perception of rejection. In a country where open dissent could imply persecution, private mockery became a valve of escape in the face of widespread hardship. Between 1980 and 1985, the combination of hunger, cold, and fear solidified Elena Ceaușescu's image as a hated figure. Her constant presence in the ministries, academia, and official events reinforced the impression that she was jointly responsible for the decisions that had led to widespread misery. In the popular perception, she was not just the wife of the head of state, but an active leader involved in the politics that conditioned every aspect of daily life. In this way, amid the economic deterioration, Elena became a symbolic target of social frustration. Her power was real, her influence visible, and her figure became associated with a regime that sacrificed the well-being of the majority to sustain a debt payment policy and a life of luxury reserved for a small elite. The terror of the regime, repression and cruel projects. By the late 1970s, the regime of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu had consolidated a totalitarian model that encompassed all aspects of life in Romania. The economic policy of extreme austerity was combined with a repressive architecture based on permanent surveillance, censorship, and fear. In that framework, Elena played a decisive role, both in promoting radical social transformation projects and in overseeing the control mechanisms. One of the most significant programs was the so-called rural systematization. Presented as a modernization plan, it consisted of the demolition of thousands of towns and villages with the forced relocation of their inhabitants to series-built housing complexes. The official argument spoke of improving access to basic services and rationalizing territorial organization, but in practice, it meant the destruction of historic communities. Churches, cemeteries, and traditional homes were razed to raise concrete blocks lacking identity and sufficient services. Elena participated in inauguration ceremonies of the new neighborhoods, which were presented as symbols of socialist progress. For the rural population, the plan was interpreted as a direct aggression against their roots and way of life. Families who had lived on the same lands for generations were expelled and relocated to impersonal apartments with reduced spaces. The result was the breaking of local traditions and the increase of resentment toward the ruling couple, especially towards Elena, who appeared as an enthusiastic promoter of the project. At the same time, the Securitate, the Romanian secret police, reached its maximum operational capacity. It was one of the most extensive repressive apparatuses in Eastern Europe, with a network of hundreds of thousands of informants deployed in factories, universities, public institutions, and even in small rural communities. The infiltration was so deep that it was common for members of the same family to be watched by each other, often without knowing it. The system used multiple informants in the same environment to cross-check data and verify its reliability, generating an atmosphere of absolute distrust. Elena was not unfamiliar with these dynamics. Although formal control lay with the Ministry of the Interior and Nicolae, she exerted influence in the selection of cadres and in the definition of priorities. She received periodic reports on ministers, diplomats, and party members, reinforcing an atmosphere of paranoia at the top. The widespread perception among officials was that every conversation could be recorded and listened to later by the comrade doctor. The methods of the Securitate included arbitrary detentions, interrogations under psychological and physical torture, and the practice of forced disappearances. Political prisoners were sent to prisons and labor camps where the conditions were equivalent to a slow sentence. After the fall of the regime, investigations confirmed that in state institutions, medical experiments had been conducted with prisoners and orphaned children as test subjects for vaccines and medications without safety protocols. Numerous deaths and serious sequelae were the direct consequence of those trials, authorized at the highest levels of the hierarchy. Elena's involvement in supervising these programs was noted by former officials and confirmed by subsequent documents. In meetings, she received information about the test results and, according to various testimonies, downplayed the fatalities or complications recorded. The disregard towards the most vulnerable became associated with her figure, fueling the perception that she was jointly responsible for especially cruel practices. In parallel, the cult of her personality reached extreme levels. Her portrait appeared in offices, schools, and hospitals, while state media published articles presenting her as an internationally renowned academic. Statues with her image were erected in public spaces, and in classrooms, children learned poems that exalted her intelligence and her maternal role towards the nation. Every party congress included speeches that reinforced the idea of a world-renowned scientist, inseparable from the country's destiny. The distance between that official image and the daily life of the population was becoming greater and greater. The contrast between the propaganda and the reality of the scarcity fueled the contempt towards it. The clandestine jokes ridiculed her as ignorant and arrogant, and her name circulated as a synonym for abuse and arrogance. In the corridors of power, her authority generated fear. In society, her image became an object of ridicule and contained hatred. The obsession of the Ceaușescu couple with controlling every detail of Romanian life was reflected in the omnipresence of security mechanisms. Microphones in offices and homes, monitoring of foreign diplomats, and control of telephone communications were common practices. Privacy had disappeared as a social category. Elena encouraged this climate of suspicion, promoting periodic purges within the party and fostering internal rivalries that neutralized any possibility of opposition. Between 1977 and 1989, Elena Ceaușescu became an inseparable part of the power nucleus. Her role in the planning of rural systematization, her influence over the Securitate, and her participation in building the cult of her personality made her a feared and rejected figure at the same time. While the official discourse insisted on presenting her as the mother of the nation and an exemplary scientist, the popular perception identified her with repression, misery, and the destruction of traditions. In those years, the propagandistic fiction reached its maximum expression. The distance between the official myth and the real experience of the population defined Elena Ceaușescu as a leader who not only accompanied Nicolae in the exercise of power, but actively shared it, directly associated with the repression and suffering of millions of citizens. The revolution erupts, the people break the silence. In December 1989, the crisis that had accumulated for more than 1 decade in Romania reached an irreversible point. The repression, scarcity, and perpetual surveillance had worn down the population, but fear remained a decisive obstacle to any uprising. That fear began to fracture in the city of Timișoara, where an apparently minor conflict became a catalyst for a national revolt. The trigger was the decision to evict the reformed pastor Laszlo Tokes, who was critical of official policies and accused of hostility towards the state. On the 16th of December, church faithful and city residents formed a human chain around the building to prevent his transfer. What began as an act of solidarity turned into an open demonstration against the regime, with slogans directed directly against Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. The response of the security apparatus was immediate. Securitate forces and military units were ordered to disperse the gathered crowd through the use of violence. The clashes left dozens of dead and injured, and many bodies were secretly removed to minimize the magnitude of what happened. The repression, far from stifling the protest, turned Timișoara into a symbol of resistance and broke the barrier of silence. In the following days, the revolt spread to other cities. The violence did not stop the mobilization. On the contrary, it fueled it. Images of the clashes and news broadcast clandestinely circulated among the population, generating a wave of indignation. In Bucharest, tension reached a critical point on the 21st of December. Nicolae called a massive rally in Palace Square with the aim of displaying strength and demonstrating that he still controlled the situation. As in previous events, thousands of people were forced to attend. The dictator appeared on the main balcony with Elena by his side and began a speech broadcast live on national television. The unexpected occurred when from the crowd, boos and shouts of protest were heard. The bewilderment was reflected on Nicolae's face. He tried to regain calm by promising salary increases while Elena urged him to continue. The crowd did not calm down. The television broadcast was abruptly interrupted, but the effect was already irreversible. For the first time in decades, the absolute power of the couple was publicly questioned. That same night, Bucharest was the scene of violent clashes between protesters and security forces. There were barricades, gunfire, and fatalities in the streets. The next day, the 22nd of December, the military apparatus began to fragment. Some units refused to fire on the population and joined the protesters. The regime collapsed. In the Central Committee building, Nicolae and Elena tried to coordinate a response, but the defection of allies and the collapse of the repressive apparatus left them isolated. A helicopter landed on the roof of the building and evacuated them along with escorts. The images of the takeoff quickly circulated. The couple who had ruled with an iron fist secretly left the capital. The helicopter headed first towards Snagov, but the situation became untenable. The airspace was monitored, and the pilot, aware of the risk of being shot down, decided to land and leave them on the ground. From that moment on, the Ceaușescus embarked on an improvised escape by road, using requisitioned vehicles and moving along secondary roads. On their journey, they tried to find shelter in different towns, but the farmers refused to help them. The attitude of the locals revealed the profound change in the relationship between rulers and the ruled. For decades, submission had been forced. In those hours, the hostility was open. The doors remained closed, and the population showed rejection towards the couple. On the 22nd of December, near Boteni, they were intercepted by a military patrol. The soldiers, upon recognizing them, proceeded to detain them. Elena maintained a haughty tone and insulted the officers, refusing to accept that they were under arrest. Nicolae, weaker, still tried to give orders, but his voice lacked authority. Both were transferred under custody to a military barracks in Târgoviște, where they were held in improvised facilities. In Târgoviște, the tension was constant. Rumors circulated about loyal troops advancing towards the barracks to rescue them, which led to strengthening security measures. Meanwhile, in Bucharest, a provisional government was being formed, made up of former communist cadres who had abandoned the dictator at the decisive moment. The uncertainty was general. No one knew for sure how many forces remained loyal to the regime or what the immediate outcome would be. The capture of the couple became a matter of utmost urgency. The mere possibility that they could regain power was perceived as an intolerable threat by the new leadership. The days that followed were marked by disorganization, rumors, and the accelerated building of a new political authority. In less than 1 week, the revolution had transitioned from the first protests in Timișoara to the collapse of a regime that had ruled Romania for more than 20 years. Elena, until then presented as an untouchable figure in official propaganda, was transformed into a prisoner under the custody of young soldiers. The woman who had wielded direct power over ministries, academies, and surveillance networks was experiencing a radically different situation. Confined in a provincial barracks, she depended on the will of guards who represented a nation in full insurrection. The fall of the Ceaușescu couple was not only the disappearance of a regime, but also the collapse of the image constructed over decades by the propaganda machinery that had exalted Elena as the mother of the nation and an exemplary scientist. The bloody end, quick trial and execution by firing squad. On the 25th of December of 1989, in the city of Târgoviște, a summary procedure was set in motion that would mark the end of Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu. 3 days earlier, they had been captured by military units after their failed attempt to flee, and the country was experiencing a chaotic scenario. In Bucharest, there was still fighting against snipers loyal to the regime. In some provinces, isolated clashes were recorded, and the structure of state power was practically collapsed. The new National Salvation Front Council, headed by Ion Iliescu and other former communist leaders, was trying to consolidate its authority while facing uncertainty about possible counterattacks from military sectors loyal to the former rulers. In that context, the couple's presence in the military barracks of Târgoviște was perceived as a direct threat. Their mere survival kept open the possibility of a restoration of the regime. Rumors about armed columns marching towards the place and rescue plans increased the pressure. For the new leaders, the solution had to be quick and definitive. They opted to organize an immediate trial without publicity and with an irreversible outcome. On the morning of the 25th of December, a military tribunal was constituted in the same barracks. It was composed of army officers, a military prosecutor, and 2 lawyers appointed as defenders. The selection of the judges was driven more by urgency than by criteria of experience. The courtroom was improvised in a dependency of the barracks, with scant furniture and the presence of armed soldiers at all times. There was no detailed procedural preparation, nor were systematic evidence or witnesses gathered. The start of the session took place around noon. The prosecutor presented a list of charges ranging from genocide to corruption, including crimes against humanity, political repression, and deliberate economic collapse. The charge of genocide was based on estimates attributing tens of thousands of deaths to the regime's policies and the violent repression of demonstrations, including the most recent ones in Timișoara and Bucharest. Charges were added for illicit enrichment through foreign accounts, embezzlement of state funds, and the use of national resources to sustain a luxurious lifestyle in contrast to widespread hardship. The presentation of the charges was brief and general. No detailed documents or exhaustive lists of victims were offered, but the court assumed that the political context and urgency justified the absence of formal evidence. The normal legal structure was replaced by a procedure aimed at obtaining an immediate sentence. Nikolai appeared in his dark coat, the same one in which he had been arrested. His reaction was of total rejection of the legitimacy of the court. He declared that only the Grand National Council had the authority to judge him, and that he remained the legitimate president of the Socialist Republic of Romania. He indicated that he was facing a coup d'état supported by foreign powers and refused to answer specific questions. He reiterated incoherent phrases about the betrayal of his subordinates and about the conspiracy of external forces against the country. His speech was monotonous, marked by the disconnection with the real situation. The image he conveyed was that of a man incapable of recognizing that his regime had collapsed. Elena showed a completely different behavior. From the beginning of the session, she interrupted judges and prosecutors, shouting, insulting, and disqualifying those who accused her. She absolutely denied all the charges, especially those related to accounts abroad. She said that the accusations were inventions of traitors and enemies of the nation. His tone was defiant. He did not just refuse the charges. He mocked those present, accused them of cowardice, and called them ungrateful. When one of the appointed lawyers suggested the possibility of pleading insanity to avoid capital punishment, he immediately insulted him and rejected any attempt at technical defense. The intervention of the defenders ended up reduced to a passive role, while the dynamics of the trial headed towards an already foreseen end. After less than 1 hour of deliberation, the court delivered its verdict. The sentence was the death penalty by firing squad for both, with immediate execution. The reading was direct, with no additional explanations or possibility of appeal. Nikolai remained silent after hearing the sentence, muttering unclear phrases. Elena responded with screams, proclaiming herself the mother of the nation and denying the judge's authority. When the soldiers entered the room to take them away, she physically resisted and had to be pushed outside. The place of the execution was a courtyard of the barracks, next to an unadorned concrete wall. The squad was made up of young paratroopers, some of them volunteers. The preparation was hurried, with no protocol procedures. The prisoners were tied and placed in front of the wall. Elena was offered a blindfold to cover her eyes, which she refused with determination. She insisted that she wanted to look at the soldiers. Her final words were insults directed at both the military and the new government. Nikolai, in a ritual attempt, began to intone fragments of the Romanian communist anthem, although his voice was weak and tremulous. At 2 hours and 50 minutes, the order to fire was given. The automatic rifles fired prolonged bursts. In a few seconds, both bodies fell, struck by dozens of impacts. The enthusiasm of the platoon was such that the shots continued even after the corpses were already motionless on the ground. A military team recorded the execution. However, only fragments of the recording were broadcast on national television the following day. The images showed the bloodied bodies in the snow next to the barracks wall as visual confirmation that the dictatorship had ended. For the population, the images had an immediate effect. In Bucharest and in other cities still under tension, the news was received with celebrations. The execution was interpreted as the definitive elimination of the symbol of terror. For years, the regime had generated constant fear. The sight of the slain bodies represented for millions of citizens a form of direct justice. The trial and execution were perceived by a large part of the population as a collective catharsis. Although it was a summary process, the speed and severity of the sentence met the desire to immediately close a cycle of oppression. In the streets, where fighting against snipers was still ongoing, the news spread by word of mouth and was received with cheers. Rumors about the capture and death of the Ceaușescus had circulated since their escape, but the broadcast of images removed all doubt. The fear that had dominated for more than 2 decades dissipated within a few hours. For many, the execution represented the final point of a regime that had reduced the population to hunger, cold, and permanent surveillance. In the rest of the world, the news provoked immediate reactions. In the West, governments expressed relief for the end of the dictatorship, but also concern about the lack of legal guarantees in the trial. International human rights organizations pointed out that the procedure did not meet basic standards of justice, although they acknowledged the exceptional situation of Romania in those days. In the socialist bloc, the execution was interpreted as an unequivocal sign of the collapse of the single-party regimes in Eastern Europe. The fall of the Ceaușescu couple added to the process of rapid transformations in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia. The death of the couple symbolized the end of an era in which repression had been justified as a defense of socialism. In less than 1 week, the Romanian Revolution had transitioned from local protests in Timișoara to the execution of the couple who had ruled with absolute power for almost a quarter of a century. The propaganda machinery that had exalted Elena as a world-renowned scientist and mother of the nation was reduced to a televised image, her lifeless body next to Nicolae's in the snow of a military barracks. Elena Ceaușescu had traveled a unique path, from illiterate peasant in Petresti to communist militant, from the leader's wife to fabricated academic, from feared co-dictator to executed prisoner. Her last day of life reflected the collapse of an entire regime, destroyed with the same speed with which Christmas was celebrated in a Romania awakening from fear.